everybody, Karen Fabian here, founder of Bare Bones Yoga. And first of all, if you're watching this video and it's your first time connecting with me, I am glad that YouTube brought us together. If you are a repeat watcher, I would love for you to write a comment just to let me know any videos you've watched before that you've enjoyed. And I want to welcome you back to my channel. So I've got a lot of kind of hands in the pot of social media. So I've got an Instagram, a Facebook group called the Bare Bones Yoga Anatomy Work Group, a Facebook page, Bare Bones Yoga, and this channel. So I have a number of different ways for you to connect with me and to learn about anatomy along the way. That is my specialty. That is absolutely what I love, to make fun and understandable for yoga teachers. And if you're a repeat viewer, you definitely know that from seeing some of my other content. So today what I wanted to do is give you a little preview about the anatomy of the hip, specifically because I have a webinar which will give you a deeper look into this anatomy. And so this is just going to be a really quick primer on just a couple of muscles that are around the hip, and maybe we'll get into some things around some of the poses where these muscles come up. I don't really script these videos before I do them. I just kind of think of a topic and talk off the cuff. So I never quite know exactly what I'm going to say, but I like it that way. It's just kind of coming up spontaneously. So let's take a look first at the hip itself. So the hip joint is a ball in a socket, which you definitely can tell by looking at it. And the other one that's like that is the shoulder. And you can kind of compare it to something like the knee, which is a hinge, right? This isn't actually, so a door like this. So hinge, right? So the knee is a hinge joint, but it's a bit of a hybrid because, as you know from doing pigeon pose, the knee also moves like this, which is definitely not how this door moves. This door only moves this way or this way. But that's the knee. Let's stick to the hip. So hip is a ball and socket, shoulder is a ball and socket, and because of that, it allows us to move in a lot of different ways. So we can move the hip like this or like that, or like this or like that, or like this or like that. So just to review, let's take a look at what those movements are. This is hip flexion, closer to the head, moving in the sagittal plane. This is hip extension, moving away from the head. This is abduction, moving away from the midline in the frontal plane. This is abduction, moving closer to the midline. And then this is external rotation, which is in the transverse plane. And this is internal rotation. And so you can tell that the hip moves in a lot of different ways. And this is one of the things about these circular joints. They give us a lot of movement. And I always like to say, with all that mobility comes great responsibility, which is so true, because just think about athletes, like think about pitchers and all the moving they're doing in that one joint, really kind of leveraging the shape of that joint to create the movement of throwing a ball. But because they're doing it all the time, they oftentimes end up with different kinds of injuries. If you want to think of something a little bit more relatable, think of something where someone's working in such a way where they're constantly lifting their arm up. They might get bursitis, they might get tendonitis, and the same thing happens with the hip. If we're constantly moving our hip in the same way all the time, without moving it in other ways, we tend to kind of exploit that particular anatomy in moving in the same way all the time, which is why it can be really helpful in your sequencing to think about taking people through different movements. The great thing about yoga and typical yoga practices, and probably things that you're already teaching, is that you're giving people lots of opportunities to move in these different planes. So let's just look quickly at some of the muscles, and the webinar I'll attach here will go into them in more detail and show you pictures. But sometimes it's nice to kind of look at it just from the body without the picture. Once we show the picture, people tend to get really hyper-focused on the anatomy picture, and they lose a sense of the whole entire body from a holistic view. And it's really important as a yoga teacher, we want to keep that holistic view rather than just honing in on the parts. So let's first look at hip flexion. So if we flex the hip, we've got a muscle that starts on the lower back here and ends up on the top of the thigh, and that's your psoas. And that's usually the most popular muscle that people refer to when they talk about hip flexion. And you can see if it starts back here and it ends here, as it shortens, it's going to pull the thigh up closer to the body. Well, if we want the muscle that does the opposite thing, it's probably something on the back. And it is. That's the gluteus maximus. So the gluteus maximus is the biggest of the three glutes, and it sits on the back of the body. And so it's back here and it takes the hip into extension. If I want to turn the hip out in that external rotation, that movement that occurs in the transverse plane, I'd have to be using a muscle in the back of the body. Because if I use something in the front or the side, it'd probably turn my hip in. But if I look at a muscle back here that connects the sacrum to the pelvis, then I could definitely open the hip. And as it turns out, the piriformis is a big muscle back here that is responsible for that hip opening. If I wanted to turn my hip in, I would use a muscle on the side of the body. And one of the glutes on the side, the gluteus medius, is an internal rotator. So that takes us through flexion and extension, external and internal rotation. And then you can also think about muscles down this outside of the body here as abductors. So you've got your tensor fascia, your glute medius, glute minimus is underneath, your tensor fascia lata, your IT band. So these muscles would take your leg out to the side. And then if you imagine muscles on the inner line of the thigh, they would most certainly in contraction bring the legs closer together. That movement is adduction. And as it turns out, we've got a big muscle there called the adductor magnus. So that's just a quick overview of muscles of the hip. And as I said, I'll include the link to the webinar. You can look at them in more detail. And I also want to just mention, I know a lot of you that are out here on the internet looking for information about anatomy are doing it in a way that's really kind of piecemeal, right? You know, you have these questions about anatomy and you're kind of out there Googling things. And I know what it's like to be kind of searching for that needle in a haystack answer to a question. And oftentimes what teachers really need is kind of a comprehensive training program on anatomy. And I offer lots of different ways to make anatomy fun and understandable. So once you look at this webinar, if you like my teaching style, if you want to learn more, one of the other things you can do that's a great way to stay connected to me and my teachings is to join the Anatomy Workgroup on Facebook. So just go on Facebook and type in the Bare Bones Yoga Anatomy Workgroup. You'll get directed to the page. You can send me an invite. There will be a couple of questions you need to answer to be admitted, so I have an understanding of your background and what you want to learn, and I make sure you are a good match for the group, because it really is specifically for yoga teachers who want to learn about anatomy versus other aspects of yoga, energetics, and that kind of thing. Of course, those things come up, but my primary focus is helping teachers learn anatomy and just making it fun and easy to understand. So I really appreciate you watching. Please click to subscribe. Please leave a comment with any questions or thoughts you had when you were watching this video. And thank you so much for watching. Namaste.